Wow, how many times have I come around this bend heading up to the R.H. Ives Gamell studios here in Williamstown, Massachusetts. It's bringing back some nice memories of the summers I spent here in the late 70s as one of his students. I'm here today to look at the Gammell experience through the eyes of my old friend and fellow student, Thomas R. Dunlay. Tom, what a sight for sore eyes.
Great to have you here. This is fantastic.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Absolutely. Look at this.
Good fun.
Look at this.
Isn't it marvelous?
The good old days.
45 years ago. Well, how does it feel to be back, Paul?
That's amazing. It's just a little mad. It's a little mad. The nostalgia is a little heavy on me here.
I know you don't like that sort of
These
thing.
are good old days. Oh yeah, yeah. Well, there it is. Gammell's own studio.
Isn't it marvelous that it still exists after all these years?
Amazing, yeah. It looks fresh as the day we were here.
It really does.
Is Gammell still in there? Would I be driving? Well, what are we heading for here?
I think his ghost is.
His ghost is in. Well, is that a good thing, or is that, what is that?
No, I think it's a good thing.
And this is that horrible painting spot. This is where we tortured ourselves in the sweating heat.
I know.
I knew nothing about landscape painting at the time. He was just killing me. You stood here, right?
I know. Of all the things that have changed, the only thing that's changed is the foliage.
Yeah, that's going to have to be trimmed if we're going to keep using this for a Northlight studio.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, it's...
No. Wow.
And all of this, which used to be a meadow, now a second...
Oh, this whole field.
Yeah, you can see right down to the brook.
I do remember that, yeah.
Quite amazing.
I could say I remember the Queen Anne's lace in exactly the same places, but I'd probably be lying.
I know.
It's one of those great miracles where the plant comes up and there's a fresh one every day.
I know. It's quite amazing.
A lot of New England was new to me. I'm from desert country.
Right. I remember
so
when you first came here, it was a big adjustment.
Yeah.
Well, I'm so pleased you could come up for this visit.
Yeah.
It's especially fun to talk about those times and what we learned, how we learned it.
Yeah. Oh no, he had the whole package. It just had this whole thing from psychologically, intellectually, spiritually, whatever you want to call it, and the pure handicraft aspect of it. He had the whole thing down.
Exactly.
He really worked it through, worked with a lot of good people.
Yeah.
And there he was passing it on to us for free. I mean, it's just truly nutty. Yeah.
It really is.
Well, today we'll be part of that.
Yeah. Well, here we are in the forbidden zone outside Mr. Gammell's quarters, his living room up here, his bedroom here.
Yeah. I think I probably stayed all the way down on the road whenever I came by here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No,
that's crazy.
A few new additions.
Yeah, the porch has grown. The deck has grown a bit. Yeah.
It's expanded quite a bit.
Yeah.
Well, it's just interesting how well he planned it, for students.
Yeah.
I mean, it was self-contained, self-sufficient.
Amazing.
And he was able to keep his privacy and live his life without us interfering.
So he'd come out of the porch there and sit on a chair out here.
Here and right up where that tree is, that was his little patio.
Yeah.
The photo of he and I sitting talking was taken right there.
Yeah.
The other thing, people don't realize, he was such a serious birder that this was paradise for him. He would come out here every afternoon, and I took him birding every morning, every Sunday morning over at Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge. Yeah. It was a passion of his. So 7 o'clock, I'd have to pick him up.
Well, you remember him wearing the binoculars. They're always on his. Exactly. Whenever he's doing critiques, he was out in the woods. He was absolutely waiting for that.
And when he was sitting here.
And he would note them in books, right? He would note the names of the birds he'd see.
He kept a record. Roger Torrey Peterson was a close friend of his, the great ornithologist.
Yes, I do remember that, yeah. So let's go talk, and we'll start the Gammell interview.
Okay.
So you've been doing a workshop here in the old haunts.
Yes.
My people have been hearing from me about Mr. Gammell, and who we advisedly, per Gammell, called Mr. Gammell. Because what would it be, he said, if we called each other by our first names?
Exactly.
But you had a pretty similar experience with me, and in the sense that this is the first serious person you'd ever met in the arts.
Yes.
You were considerably younger than me when you did meet Gammell, so
I
I'd met a few more maybe than you. Maybe not, I don't know.
No, I was 19, and the experience I had, Paul, was similar to, I think, most of the students that passed through the studios. After graduating from high school, I chose to go to art school. I wanted to be a painter. I came under, the influence of my father, who was a very talented amateur and had exposed me to people like Sargent, and I always knew that that was the kind of painting I wanted to do. But like most of us, I had gone to Mass College of Art, and I was incredibly disappointed. I knew from day one, the first time I walked through the doors, that this was not a place where I was going to learn anything about painting at all. So I, for lack of someplace else to be, I stayed for a while. But I immediately set out on the search, which most of us seem to have done in a very similar fashion, looking for some link with the late 19th century painters who were trained in a way where, they learned a craft. I wasn't seeing that in art school, and I wasn't seeing any link. And that was the real mystery to it, was how in such a short period of time could that kind of training evaporate it.
Yeah, how would you have known that there was this, you're calling this a link? How was that, because of your father's background? Did you have information
my
suggested
father,
that to you?
yes, he unfortunately didn't have exposure personally to great painters, but he was aware of people like Aldro Hibbard.
Yes.
And although I didn't really read Hibbard's biography, I recognized the quality in his work that I wasn't seeing in the works of the teachers at art school at that time. But I just knew there was a missing link. And one of the things that did happen just before I met Mr. Gammell was I saw a Boston painter show at the Museum of Fine Arts. And it wasn't the one that people look back on in the 80s and think was the great Boston Painter Show. This was an earlier one in 1971, where they really, it was sort of a random show. It was very much unpublicized, taking American masterpieces from the basement, things that hadn't been shown in 20 or 30 years. And there, for the first time, I saw Benson, Paxton, Tarbell, and I knew there had to be a link, but I still wasn't aware. I couldn't find anybody who knew about these painters, or if they had pupils or descendants. So actually one day, while I was walking down Newbury Street, I was at the end of my rope. I was ready to give up painting. I didn't feel as though I was going to ever find that person. I walked into the Copley Society, and there was an older gentleman there. His name was Bill Pitt, and he was the manager. And I told him of my plight, that I was looking for someone to study with, a real serious painter who would teach painting as a craft, as the language that one could easily understand, and teach in a discernible way. And he called me out to the street. He said, "Come on, I want to show you something." We walked out to the sidewalk on Newbury Street, and he pointed to the very end, and he said, "See that red brick building there? There's a gentleman you need to meet." And he gave me R.H. Ives Gamell's name and told me to look him up in the phone book and give him a call.
That's the first time I've heard that story.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. Very different from some of the others.
Yeah. So I did call him, and I got my miserable portfolio together. I showed up at 2 o'clock at the appointed time. I remember entering on the studio balcony. You know what it was like the first time seeing that, and it was almost a deja vu type of experience. Looking over the balcony, and I felt I had almost seen it before. And
I'm showing this slides of that.
I remember walking down the staircase and seeing his work, and then going over to his seating area. And the first thing was that he asked me, who are your 5 favorite painters? A question he often asked everybody who he was interviewing for the first time. And fortunately, I had some decent answers. Sargent, was of course my first answer, and I think I mentioned Monet, but it wasn't a case of where he kicked me out because if I had, if we had said Picasso or something like that, he wouldn't have given us the time of day. Yeah. So I had the right answers, but after our discussion and after his looking at the portfolio, he wasn't impressed by the portfolio. He knew
you knew nothing. Typical of all of us.
Exactly. He I think in some way admired the industry, and he said, unfortunately, I have no room for you. I'd like to be able to help you, but what I am going to do is introduce you to Bob Hunter, a pupil of mine who has recently started teaching, and after talking with him, perhaps there's something he can do for you. Right. So upon leaving, he said, stay around, don't go away, stay around. And what he meant by that was, don't take this as a no, but unfortunately, I don't have any room.
Well, yeah.
So,
So he had Sam Rose and a handful of other people still at that time?
Sam Rose was still working with him. I think Sam at that point was the only mature student, and there were a couple of very beginning students. I think it was David Ziegler and another fellow, I can't remember his name. So he did introduce me to Bob, and I went to Bob, and that experience, after meeting Bob, that was very impressive too, seeing a working painter, working on pictures, solving problems. But what was even more impressive was going to the studio of his students. And at that time, David Lowry and Ernie Principato were studying with Bob. And for the first time, I saw a contemporary doing work that just literally blew me away. And I said, this is it. I know where I want to be. David was doing a cast drawing that, to me, not having any training, looked remarkably good. And as you know, Prince in those days, he was a gifted painter and, could paint a beautiful still life. So I remember going home to tell Katie, my wife Katie, 46 years or so, about my experience. And I told her, I have great news. I'm quitting art school, and I know what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. And I worked with Bob, all that, next coming winter. I spent the summer from April to November in Provincetown painting landscapes with David Lowry and Ernie Principato.
So that was in Provincetown and not in the
very first year.
Yeah.
So then the following May, I was around the studios. I was working hard doing cast drawings, and Bob Hunter seemed to take notice because when a position came available, David Ziegler had left and the other student had left. Mr. Gammell needed someone to come to Williamstown, where we are right now in his fabulous summer studios, summer home and studios. And I was available, so he invited me to come study with him.
Right. So, Tom, I want to walk you back, though. You came into Gammell Studio sort of a long time ago. Would you just share with us your reactions, first of all, to your personal reactions, but secondly, your sense of what Gammell was, and what you saw in his presence when you first met him there. And by the way, I'm doing this. I have no intention of making a god out of Gammell. He wasn't a god, any more than the rest of us are. But there's an element of what he did that obviously deserves a great deal of honor. So when I ask that, I'm really asking a young 20-year-old to walk into a room, and there you are.
And it was an extraordinary experience. And I do believe part of me at the time realized that something extraordinary was happening, something very special. And what I saw was a man who recognized what was going on around him when the rest of the world was happy and content to go along as if there were no issues with, the education of painters at the time.
Why do you say that? Did he say something about that? Did he ask you where you'd come from? And what would have gotten you to that understanding so early on?
I think it was simply the juxtaposition of having been in art school for 18 months. And, seeing that there was no teaching, there was no organized system for helping me improve my work. There was no interest in learning to draw. Our art schools, it was simply based on the assumption that when you entered, you were an artist, and this was an environment to grow and express yourself personally with all the freedom you wanted. Whereas entering into the studios of R.H. Ives Gamell was a very, very different matter. It was a highly organized program, but everybody's program and what they did was individualized. So what I was doing, as a very beginner, was very different from what you probably were doing. I remember you coming in with a considerable amount of experience. So you were, he customized your course of study, according to your skills, your ability, what you knew at the time, and what he perceived your strengths to be and your interests to be. I was a complete newbie. All I had, was just a little bit of drawing that I did on my own, copying photographs or whatever. I had never worked from life at all. So I was one of those that fell into the...
So tell us about Gammell as the first day teacher. What was Gammell doing on the first day with the guy who's the newbie you're talking about?
Exactly. It was an amazing experience. You were expected to, every day we would have to meet at 7:45 at the studio, and we would outline what the morning was going to be. And, the way these types of studios function, the way I teach, and I know the way you teach, is that you're not necessarily there on the first day, but it didn't happen to be an older student. So I was literally the only one. So I got the benefit of a personal demonstration on how to set up a cast. I was new to working in a North Light studio.
Right.
I had a year of experience with Bob Hunter,
Yes.
but he went over the rudiments of how to set up a cast in natural light. Looking for the big division of light and shade,
Right.
an interesting arabesque.
Yeah.
He literally went through all those
Yeah.
ground rules. That sometimes, like I said, we have an older student teach the younger student, and he would literally give a demonstration, showing you how to sharpen your charcoal, how to get a very, very fine point.
And he did all those things with you.
He did do all
yes,
those things.
Yeah. I did have that secondary person
Yeah.
do that, sharpening charcoals
Right.
and all that sort of stuff.
But he was there, ready to
Yeah.
intercede if you got the wrong information on that very,
Yeah. No question.
first demonstration. Because it's, there's a great quote by William Morris Hunt, we're all victims of our first teacher.
Right.
Meaning that if you're taught wrong, then you spend the rest of your life trying to undo the bad teaching.
Yeah.
So it was very important for him to, in the very beginning, make sure you got it right.
Yeah.
And I had the benefit of that. And I remember, those first, couple of months, it was, lots of cast drawings, lots of starts, not taking a drawing to a high degree of finish. But
Not noodling for 6 months.
Right, exactly. I remember him clearly saying on the first day, as well as the last day I saw him in the studio, shape, value, color. Get the big shape, the arabesque, get it correctly, get the big division of light and shade, get your masses in, get the correct value, and, if you're painting, color is the last thing that's important, but get those, values, quickly and right away.
Yeah. So when he was speaking to you in the studio, what was this kind of the sort of tenor of his conversation? He said to me once, and maybe he said this to you, did he tell you how he taught? Did he use an expression that says, I teach X, Y, I do this is what my studio is all about, this is what I do? Did he say things like that to you?
Well, he made you very aware of how his predecessors and his teachers were trained.
Yeah.
And like I said, he customized it, what he taught you, based on where he felt you were at. But he kept it very simple. I mean, it wasn't a complex thing.
So a sentence here, a sentence there.
Yeah.
Not a long explication.
I remember, and you probably still have some of your notes. He gave us a little 3x5 pad of paper, and he told us to write down everything he says. And every session you were with him, every criticism.
He made it clear that you do it after he left.
Right.
Not while he was standing there with a pen in your hand.
Exactly. Write the quotes down, write the stories down.
Right.
He would always mention that, the real history of painting is the history of the studio gossip. It's what painters say, in the studio talking to each other. And he made a strong point. That's why he wanted us to write these things down. His book, Shop Talk of Edgar Degas, was a collection of quips and stories that he had collected, over a long period of time. And, after going through them and sifting through them, he felt that he had really come to understand the nature and personality of Degas, and he wanted us to do the same thing, with him.
So do you remember to this day certain of these aphorisms, of these axiomatic expressions, whatever he happened to be throwing at you at a given time?
Like you probably do, I quote maybe 30, 40 times a day.
Yeah, different ones. What would be a good example of say an early one, or maybe just any maybe your favorites, maybe some of them stick to you more than others.
Well, one, it's a favorite of mine, and I've heard you say it many times, and I've read it in many of your writings, the famous quote from Bonnat, make it like, make it more like, and then make it more like nature, something to that effect.
Yes.
But, a young student asking him how he should proceed, and Bonnat said, make it like. I believe Mr. Gammell's way of teaching was, give us the equipment, the knowledge, the understanding of how to render nature, and then our own personality based on whatever it is in our personality that wants to be expressed or needs to be expressed, based on our background, education, all of those elements combined might have the possibility of coming out if we understand how to express ourselves in terms of nature. And nature was the basis of everything.
So there must have been some systematic things he would have you do in the drawing portion, say the cast. What would those kinds of things have been?
Well, what's interesting in it, now that I'm teaching on a much more involved level, I realize it, and it's interesting these things come back, is how especially with cast drawing, how the emphasis should be on not making over-noodled drawings, over-rendered drawings, over-seen drawings. Right. It's not getting a photographic, finish on your charcoal drawing, but simply learning to see the shapes dead accurately, so that when you're faced with a live model, a moving model, and you're with a limited amount of time, within those 1, 2, 3, 4 sessions, you'll be able to render the thing the way it appears. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was always about making nature appear the way it does.
I remember I'm using the expression, the look of nature.
Yeah, the look.
The look.
Exactly.
It's always about the appearances.
Yeah. And so, there were no rules. There were no color mixing classes.
Yes.
There was no Munsell formulas or anything like that. It was simply, like Nikolai Fechin said, there are only 3 colors, and everything that we see in nature is some combination of those 3 colors. Yeah. And that, it's something that well-trained painters don't think about, and untrained painters don't realize.
Yes, absolutely true.
So we were given set orders in terms of what palette to use, and I still stick with basically the same palette today as I.
And what was that palette on? My viewers want to hear that.
Give
a list. Do you mind?
And this palette, was the palette that he laid out every day. So there's 2 slight versions of it. One was the indoor version, and the other was the outdoor version. But to start where we're in Williamstown, where so much of his landscape teaching went on, I'll start with the outdoor palette, and it was alizarin crimson, cadmium scarlet. Today with all the manufacturers, can be confusing, but basically the brightest cadmium red, the real, light one, or sometimes it goes by cadmium light. Cadmium lemon, your cool yellow. Cadmium yellow medium, or some brands call it cadmium yellow pale.
The warmer version of the high-end one.
Right, exactly. So that combined with your cadmium scarlet can then give you those warm greens that you like. Yellow ochre, as Ang said, God's gift to painters. It's the one color that
I'm so ashamed of myself for throwing Ang under the bus. You keep going.
But in landscape, it makes great sense, because there are those greens that sometimes combined with ultramarine, it's almost a gray green.
Yes.
It's a wonderful note for getting, and the only green that's on the palette. But the interesting thing is, with the green New England landscape, you seldom use it as viridian, and cerulean blue, which is very important for painting skies in New England, cobalt blue, and ultramarine.
So you had no other earth colors on that palette?
No, for out of doors,
no.
Right, out of doors, no, and we use flake white #2. So for indoors, you had the addition of ivory black, Indian red, light red, and burnt sienna.
Did you use Naples yellow, or is that just me? In
No,
the old days?
I
I don't remember what that was. I thought I got that from Gammel, but I may have gotten that at the league.
I think Lackett had used it a lot. I think it might have come from Gary, and the sort of the maybe first mentions of it, and then any of the cadmiums as needed indoors. If you had that scarlet red scarf on a portrait, you might need it. But
so Tom, sorry, yeah.
No, but in terms of painting flesh, it was the Indian red, light red, ivory black, flake white, burnt sienna.
Yeah. So you told me an interesting story earlier that I never heard before, and I did not do it with Gammel, but you described the brown paper thing.
Right.
And when you're starting to paint, and you described a demonstration. You mind go through that for our
Sure.
Our guys?
And it's something I've found to be very, very effective. Very often in his own work, his own studies, especially some of the ones shown here, the Holy Grail, with the mountain, behind the figures, that actually was done on brown paper, brown wrapping paper, craft paper, very, very large.
That image we're looking at there is actually the brown paper?
That may actually be the canvas, but the brown paper version actually looked remarkably good. The other small allegorical picture on the easel was actually, that's brown paper, which he made the careful drawing to begin with, and then he would seal it and then give it a...
And you're talking about the one, I think I have an arrow.
One,
this one right up here,
right there.
the upper left people.
Right.
Yeah.
The preparatory piece for that was done on brown paper, and then shellacked, and then as if it was a final piece.
So this is an outline drawing.
Outline drawing.
And then it was shellacked.
Yes, and then painted directly.
Yeah, so that was shellac, so it would seal the paper, so it wouldn't eat up your paint. You'd actually be able to.
And I have pieces of his from that period, 50, 60 years old, that are as fresh as the day they were painted.
I know.
But in terms of teaching, he would apply the same thing. I remember my very first still life. It was very simple arrangement of a horn and a piece of fabric and a pear on a green tabletop. I did a very careful drawing in charcoal on brown paper. The paper was oversized, much larger than the arrangement of objects. And I did the careful drawing.
Now, when you say drawing, you don't just mean outline. You mean you did more than that?
It was as if it was a cast drawing, yeah.
It was a modeled up
trying to go for a full range of values.
Right.
Making it look as much like, but not spending an inordinate amount of time on it. But get the masses right, get the shapes correct. And then what we did, we took what we call strip teasers.
We still use that word.
Right, exactly. Long strips of brown paper, or they can be foam core or whatever, and lay the drawing on the floor, and then adjust the strips of paper to the shape of the composition. That way, the reason he did it for two reasons. One, the main reason was simply so that you had a good plan. You could establish your composition. So when you transferred it to the canvas, there were no issues in terms of placement, no need to move something 3 inches or 4 inches, or you hadn't given yourself enough room. You knew what all the variables were to begin with. But in the very early stage on that first still life, he actually had me shellac it after we had chosen the size of the composition. And as a prelude, really a warm-up to painting on the canvas.
You couldn't spray shellac in those days.
I know. We'd spray some fixative on the brown paper.
Right. And then you could
give it a coat of shellac. But
as you can see, I never did that, for my viewers.
But ordinary bullseye shellac, the kind you buy at the hardware store, it's wonderful and it has a wonderful amber tone to it. So that the paint that you lay on top actually reacts wonderfully to it.
Yeah.
And it grips it extremely well. Immediately you have a surface that you can work on.
Right.
So my first still life was a little bit different. I don't know if he did a demonstration still life for you.
He did not, actually.
But I had done the drawing. I shellacked, I composed the composition, and he came in to the studio and he said, and a lot of, I remember when you saw him coming down the stairs to give the criticism, you could see the mind going, and he had already determined, what the lesson for you at your point in time was going to be that day. And I'm not sure the day before he had planned on doing a lay-in on that still life, But as he came down the stairs, he said, I think it would be a good idea if I showed you how to lay this still life in.
Right.
And, he proceeded to pick up the brush, and, we had the equalizer, which was a box that was 13.5 inches.
This is quotes, equalizer.
Equalizer. Yeah. We had a box, because David Lowry, who later became a student, was the same height as I was, and there was a 13.5 inch difference in our heights. Yes. So that box put him at exactly my eye level. So he would step up to the box every day and every time.
And grab your arm.
Like grab the arm and hold on. And, the old man's wobble, he would describe. But his eye was as, dead right and as accurate as could be. He laid that picture in about an hour and a half. He covered the paper, hit the background note, hit the pear as if it was, the final session on a, month-long still life. I mean, he did a remarkable job. Yeah. It was the greatest lesson I ever had.
So tell us what he did. I mean, what
what
notes did he put down? Where did he put them?
The paint was laid out on the palette like the keys on a piano.
Right.
I was a good student. I had my alizarin to the left and my ultramarine to the right.
Why do we still do that? I wonder.
My white in the middle. I gave him a handful of brushes, and he proceeded to explain that the most logical way of working was to go after the darkest dark, and then work towards the lightest light. And he also explained that where we were working on such a toned paper that if we had been working on a white canvas, we would have followed that exactly. But he explained that where this is toned, some of the middle values are basically already there. So we're going to put the thing down that's going to make the biggest difference. So he did go after the darkest dark, and then he went after the lightest light. And like Sargent said, you see in his things written about him, he worked towards the middle, with the tone of the paper being, the middle tone. But it was a concentrated effort to, observe the thing as a whole, and put.
And those words were in his mouth at the time. The thing as a whole. He was saying that to you at the time.
Observe it as a whole.
The first day.
Not to look at things piecemeal.
Yes.
But to try to render the subject as it appeared to your eye. Right. Looking at the whole. Right. There was a pear in the picture, right. And he was very adamant about not becoming bogged down by wanting to render the pear, yes. That it was just a spot of yellowy green, with an orangey shadow, to the left of it. And, the horn, it was a sort of a brass horn, to hit the note that, would make it, make it look more like the paper. The way he explained the objective to me was to take the paper or canvas and make it look as much like nature as possible. So to follow, actually to use your words, the logical order of working. What made most sense to put down first to get that canvas or paper to look like nature.
Yeah.
And it's the visual order.
And I've heard that from everyone, Hunter, all the rest of the people that worked with Gammell. So was there an element of being systematic that was always persistently with him? Was it always clear that he was working systematically?
It really was. So often, I mean, the world at large, thinks that art is an emotional thing. But I believe, from everything I heard from him personally and the discussions we had, was that the more you concentrate on making nature, making it look like nature, and searching for the beauty, the more chance you had actually to express yourself, but that one should be devoid of trying to express yourself.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, I remember.
So there was order, to painting the pictures, and especially out of doors. I mean, he was a great admirer of Monet, and in particular, Mrs. Perry's essay on Monet, yes. Where Monet she actually describes Monet's working method of, only working 20 minutes, while the light was, correct and not exceeding that, right. And not chasing the light. That was basically, the way he, insisted we work out of doors. The famous quote, talking about the quotes, that he would, give us every day was, Monet, put down a triangle of red, an oblong of yellow, a little square of blue. Put the right shape, right value, and right color in the right place. Yeah. And your drawing will actually take care of itself. Yeah,
the evolution that comes to the Boston School out of Monet. Yeah,
exactly.
That's very clear. Yeah,
exactly.
So, what was the rest of his curriculum like? Would you have called it a curriculum? You spent there 5, 6, whatever you said, years.
Right.
Yeah,
the daily schedule in a nutshell, and
we'll go bigger, of course, past daily, but do that. Yeah.
Right. When I started in 1970, actually the May of '72, I was the only student. But by the end of the summer, I had encouraged Mr. Gammell to invite David Lowry to come on. So going into that next fall, there was David and myself. And then you came along shortly.
So he was literally down to one student, or had lost all of them, and you were then showed up.
Right.
Huh. Was that one of the classic breakups? I want to get back to the curriculum thing, but you put me right in that place.
Right.
But was that one of those things? Because that's one of those things that comes with the territory of who Gammell was this things would happen, and the world would just
it was an incredibly
it
was an incredibly complex situation, and the feelings and attitudes and moods in the studio were never limited to the student who was the current student. There was a whole cast of older students.
Hangers-on, or people in the neighborhood,
and
in the building.
People in previous generations.
I remember you mentioning one.
Who had studied with him. Some left on good terms, some left on bad terms.
And some were outspoken about it.
Right.
And in pernicious ways for the next generation.
Right. I remember, when I was invited to study with him, I actually had a number of people come to me and say, you're making a mistake. He'll destroy your personality. Watch out. Don't study with him. Yeah. And I ignored all those.
I never saw it in his suggested that he was doing that.
Yeah. By the time you came on board, Paul, as we were saying earlier today, I think Mr. Gammell, was probably in his best period as a teacher. He had
at least uncertainty about himself about it, enjoying it.
Yeah. Well, and he also had 5 terribly hungry students who were only interested in one thing, and that was knowledge and information. And when you were extracting that from him, he was in his element. He loved it. I know. He was passionate about it, because after all, the only reason he taught was because of his own experience, and he had lived through the last great golden age of painting.
He couldn't find the information.
Yep, exactly. When he graduated from the museum school in 1911, the American painting was at its zenith. You had Benson, Paxton, Tarbell, Chase, Sargent, Willard Metcalf, Daniel Garber. I mean, the list goes on
Blatchford was still
and
around,
probably. Kenyon Cox. I mean, you had, and plus you had the American women. You had Elizabeth Paxton. You had Lillian Hale. You had Gretchen Rogers. I mean, it was an extraordinary, extraordinary times. No one imagined that it was all going to fall apart, and within 20 years, that kind of education wouldn't be available.
Yeah. But we've talked about that takeover of the institutions.
But what puts him in such an incredibly unique situation was that he graduated in 1911 from the museum school, and he had got that extraordinary training from those men. And his great desire was,
albeit incomplete, the speed version of it,
exactly.
Which he admits,
He realized that it was incomplete, even though he was with the great men. Yeah. And he said, I'm going to go to Paris, because there has to be people still alive who studied with the great, great Frenchmen. Yeah. And so he went to Paris, and he was just so disappointed. He could not find what he thought should be there.
And he was told to go back to the U.S. It was better there.
Yeah, he was told. So, then we have, Pancho Villa and the Mexican War.
Oh, no, we don't,
and we have World War I. So, his life is completely interrupted in his ability to get that training. I have to believe if he hadn't gone in the service and the war hadn't started, he probably would have found Paxton earlier. But, we all know the story about him meeting Paxton in Provincetown, and him telling Paxton of his plight. And Paxton at that time, you had to, credit him as being one of the, the best draftsman in America, one of the best painters in America.
He was probably the most as knowledgeable as anybody.
Knowledgeable, and he had really paid attention to his time in Paris.
You know, we're going into history that anybody can read. And I don't want to do that with this time with you.
Exactly.
I want to stick right with your experience.
I'll get to that fulcrum point.
Yeah.
Why Mr. Gammell taught, I believe. He had met Paxton on the beach, and Paxton said, "If you ever get into trouble, come around."
Right.
And he didn't have the feelings towards Paxton. He thought, oh, he was a nice guy, but I don't really want to paint like him or study with him. Right. And then he realized he just couldn't find anybody to help him. Yeah. So he called on Paxton, and there began the 20-year, daily association, where he took 2 years off to, learn to draw, under Paxton's guidance. He drew with Paxton every Friday afternoon. And that, I believe, was the seeds for his own studio school. He never used the word atelier. It was R.H. Ives Gamell Studios, But I believe that from that and the writing of Twilight of Painting in 1940, he had actually started in the late 30s with George Melnick as his first student. Right. And I think he realized that how important this was because. As 1911, like I said, none of the great painters. He remembers talking with Benson and Tarbell and DeCamp, and none of them dreamed that it would evaporate as quickly as it.
I want to take you back though. Let's go to the curriculum thing because you're talking about stuff people can read,
right,
and probably even stuff you may have written about him already. So it's better. Sure. What I really am trying to do, it's just really the idea of staying with your experiences with Gammell because that's what's fresh.
Right. So what he I think very, very carefully thought out through his own knowledge of history and how the studios were set up and his own discussions with, Tarbell and Paxton, how the ateliers, were set up and organized. Right. He desired to really model a very small studio school after that, 2 to 5 pupils at a time. Right. Giving them a great deal of attention. In this country, he really modeled it after Howard Pyle. He thought a great deal of Howard Pyle and how he organized his teaching system with his students, and he had a small group of students around him.
So, what was that curriculum? I mean, what was involved in that, and what did you see in more particular in your walkthrough?
Well,
we do it in a typical school. You're doing. We think of it this day as cast drawing and still life painting and figure drawing and portrait painting.
The main points of his teaching were cast drawing. I mean, you started out. It was the most logical, fundamental way, for people to begin to acquire command over their ability to see shapes. Yes. And as you remember, memory drawing was introduced very early. Yeah. And memory drawing is one of those things, if you do it, your work is going to be, it's going to race ahead, and because it trains your eye and brain to see the salient elements, the most important aspects of what you're looking at. Yeah.
To take ownership of them,
Exactly, and it was interesting. He was very careful to explain it to us. He encouraged us to do it, but he made no demands on it. Right. And those that did it advanced a little quicker, than those that didn't. Yeah. So that was a major part of the curriculum. And then, as you remember, afternoons were really dedicated to figure drawing. Yeah. So we would have the model Monday through Friday, 5 days a week, 2 hours at a time, from 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock, basically. Yeah. And then as you
and that was for you. What year was that happening in the first year?
Basically,
the figure was actually there for you in the first
after
year?
that first year.
After the first year.
He told us to get models, and I remember, I think at one time there were 4 of us.
Oh, working in.
You were there, Dave Lowry. Yep. Jan Posvar.
And Gary Hoffman.
Yeah, Gary Hoffman. We would all stand back and
crazy stories.
Far into that studio. And then, as I remember, I painted probably, 3 or 4 still lifes with him. It went from the very simple to, a very large, complicated one, and several in between. And I enjoyed it. I loved it and whatnot. And then, we would advance to a head, a head and shoulders.
Yeah.
I think the interesting thing was that was probably the one area where he didn't push it on people early. I think he could have. He always wanted you to acquire more skills before you took on a head.
Something to do with his own experience, maybe, or something.
Exactly. But summers up here in Williamstown, the morning was oftentimes devoted to a head. We would hire local models, and they'd come up and pose for 4 or 5 days at a time.
Yeah, I may as well actually make that visible to people. There you are.
Right.
Yeah.
Actually, that's a picture that a pastel painting that both Gary Hoffman and I were working on. That's him correcting on Gary's picture, yep. And I was right to the right side of the model. But he was. The criticisms were marvelous. He really looked at them in cold blood and told you where you stood. There was no
Do you remember a particular critique in this one? Do you remember, was it something in this off? Was this off? Was that off? Was that coming through? Or
it was.
Was it more how you think about things?
It was always, what's most important, what's to think about first,
Yep.
Getting the masses shapes and values right.
Yeah.
But, there were things, I remember right now what he's doing, blending with his finger,
yes.
Pulling the tone together.
Yes.
There was no sugarcoating it. His criticisms were never, namby-pamby. He always got right to the meat of the issue. And if you were offering your drawing, he, just short of belittling you, would.
I don't know if you had the same experience, but he would, he would go after this thing that he was calling the backstraggler.
Right.
And I remember at first thinking, I can do that or not do that.
Right.
And eventually you realize you better do that because
right.
it changed everything in the picture.
Right.
You began to get into his mind. Did
right.
that happen with you? That sort of idea?
Absolutely. That really was the first thing in every criticism. What is most wrong with the picture? What can you do to make the greatest improvement on this? And the other thing was to never continue to work on what was most interesting about the picture. That would take care of itself. No, he was very orderly in that sense. It was always the backstraggler.
Yeah.
Always.
So it was always the big look and the big relationships.
Yeah,
that sort of thing.
the big look, the big, big relationships, the backstragglers.
Yeah.
No question, about that at all.
And I want to give you this one too while we're at it. And we don't have to sit on these.
This
guys,
was a fun photo, and I wish we had all been a little more daring in taking photos of him. There were two reasons not many photos exist of this time period. Was one, none of us had cameras, and the other thing was we were always a little bit intimidated to take his photo, thinking that he might get angry. But this photo is a great story. It's Gary Hoffman, David Lowry, and myself. And we were all anxious to paint the figure out of doors, and we would ask him if we could hire a model, and he would continually say, "No, you're not ready."
Yes.
Maybe later on down the road we'll do it. And he was pretty adamant about it. So we one Sunday the three of us decided, let's pool our money and we'll just hire a model, to come pose for us. So. And Sunday mornings were Liberty Hall. We could do whatever we wanted.
Gammell's expression, Liberty Hall.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we hired the model, and 10 o'clock in the morning, and she's posing on the hillside. And then all of a sudden, he comes rushing out. He has his smock on, his rubber gloves.
He's pulling his rubber gloves.
Exactly. He grabs the brushes and starts criticizing.
I know.
I shouldn't be doing this, but this is all wrong. You have to paint the value of the way it actually appears. You can't be. Putting this namby-pamby color down, you have to put it with all its forthrightness. And it was a marvelous experience. We had the greatest time, and just pearls of wisdom and information and knowledge just dripping from every word that he said. You have to think back. Here's a guy who worked for 20 years. receiving criticism from Paxton.
Yeah.
He was in Benson's class at the museum school. Joseph DeCamp, he was in charge of escorting DeCamp around Paris when DeCamp was commissioned to paint the Treaty of Versailles. Right. The people that he came in contact with, the knowledge, and he was so hungry for information himself. And by this time, with that first major crop of students, Bob Hunter, Bob Cormier, Bob Cumming, he really felt this terrible sense of urgency, that it was up to him. He all around him, his contemporaries failed to see what was going on and weren't interested in what was going on. Hibbert continued to teach us, nice classes in Hibbert and Rockport to amateurs and whatnot. And he realized that if he didn't do something very serious, the craft of painting, as it was known 70 years before, 50 years before, was going to evaporate completely.
Did he try to encourage you to teach?
He did. I remember him saying, I want to see you become, a good painter, but at some point in your own career, when the situation warrants it and you're able to, I expect you to teach.
Right. Tom, we're running to the hour on this thing, and we don't have a ton more time. Think about it, or even just mention whatever you feel like, except of your experience. Give us some of the most crucial things about the thing that we haven't talked about yet, about the experience itself. I mean, what's the life-changing thing? What's the part you couldn't have done without and become a good painter, the good painter you are today? Well, that sort of thing. I know it all blends together. I get
exactly.
That. Yeah.
Well, the thing that separated it so much from what we call formal education today, going to an institution, was that this was not going to school. This was living a life. And from 8 o'clock in the morning till 8 o'clock at night, it was full immersion. And it wasn't just the studio work. It was every aspect of it. It was the continual visits, once or twice or 3 times a week to museums. Standing in front of the work of painters who he knew personally, and could literally explain what their objectives were as painters. Not many people know this, but he was concerned with our overall education.
Yeah.
I was an ordinary kid from the suburbs south of Boston, Weymouth, Massachusetts. It was, one of the first things I remember him doing was, sending us to the opera.
What the heck?
What is all this all about?
Did you see the Parsifal? Was that your first one, or was it?
I saw the Ring Cycle 3 times.
Oh, gee, yeah.
and the God of
that was vicarious on Gammell's part.
The Meistersinger, but also here in Williamstown, the Summer Theater, which was one of the most marvelous summer stock theaters in the country. We saw the greatest performances of the classics plus new things.
Molière, I've never seen it presented any better than him.
Exactly. Sarah Caldwell in Boston in the 70s, her opera company, it was just so amazing and unbelievable. And these were things that had honestly profound, they made profound differences in my life.
He also was the first person I ran into, maybe you remember the same thing, that he was pursuing, giving us he was trying to create a classical education for us, just in terms of reading. What did you read? What did you read?
Well, and that was the marvelous thing. I remember being given the admittance ticket to the Athenaeum and told, read whatever you want, follow your nose, but just report to me every Friday. What you're reading. It could be anything. And, it always helped to read what he was interested in, Somerset Maugham and, Henry James and people like that. But it could be art history. One of the most profound experiences for me was that, I believe that I understood what was going on and the value and importance of it at the time was, here was the guy who knew these people. So if you remember the exhibition catalogs, the entire collection of National Academy shows from from the early days.
These little catalogs. Fat little bird.
Along with the Pennsylvania Academy, the Corcoran Show,
Yep.
you know, the Carnegie Mellon Show. These were the great national exhibitions that all the best painters of the day participated in. And that was sort of my history course with him. You know, I remember taking those volumes and spending 20 minutes with him every day, right. Just flipping through them, getting his opinion on these pictures. And they were in black and white, yeah. And him describing his personal interactions with those painters or his knowledge of those painters, right. Stories, quips, quotes. It was the best education you could imagine. Yeah. It was really extraordinary.
Yeah. So there's an element of the Groton education that he had, which is one of the most superior ones that at that time could have been gotten by anybody. Yeah. You know, he'd say he would sort of apologize for never having gone to college or the next level or right. whatever, but what you got at Groton was better than most people's college.
Oh, exactly. You know, I mean,
especially in terms of your skills as a student of something.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, he you know, with the Groton education, he spoke several languages. I mean, he wrote his diary in Italian. It was really quite extraordinary.
And us Hicks from French Lick, you know, we were hanging in there.
Yeah, we did an amazing job for being, you know, ordinary pedestrians. But the thing that really was wonderful was that he, you know, if he recognized the spark, if he recognized the interest, the determination, he responded to it. That was all he was interested in. He didn't care about your background, your culture, or who you were, or what you were. You know, there was nothing there. You know, and you remember when you'd stop for lunch with him on the road, he'd tell the waitress, we're painters. We don't have time. Give us the...
That's a good point. Yeah, he would never use the word artist. And,
we're painters.
We're painters,
yeah. Exactly. And it was... But just to sum him up completely, I think, you know, as he described himself, he was in a unique situation at the time he was born and the people he was exposed to. He recognized that, you know, this way of painting and this way of teaching was evaporating incredibly quickly. Yeah. And if he didn't do something about it, it might be lost forever. So he tried to, you know, create a blueprint for how to learn it. Yeah. And, you know, how to, if not how to do it or how to learn it, you know, how to figure out how to do it.
Yeah, he gave you the information as best you could do it in writing. It was unusual, but he also pointed you to the Coxes and other people who had written also, and the balance of those things taken together was pretty good.
Exactly.
We are out of time, Tom. Thank you very much.
Paul, thank you.
We'll have to do it again. You know, the idea of Gammell's big, and what he did for us individually.
It is.
You couldn't have gotten this anywhere else. You couldn't have this in this country. And I was one of those people just like you who couldn't have. It just, you know, what do? You just give up because you don't want fake. Right. You want the real thing. Right. So that was the big gift from my point of view. And
exactly. Why do we make pictures? Just to make images, or is there something, you know, bigger, something deeper?
And overall, man's history. Why do we? Yeah. Exactly. And you put those thoughts into your mind. Kept you focused.
Exactly. It's not about superficial image making.
Oh, he took the whole thing so seriously, didn't he?
He did. Yeah. He did. Yeah. Well, this is a pleasure, Paul. And I also look forward to doing it again. Yeah. Thank you.
We'll have to.
Excellent.
Yeah. And thank you all. Don't forget to subscribe, share, comment, and all the rest of those things. And I do want to thank everybody out there who's made it possible for you to actually see this video this time. You knew we had to raise funds up to $1,000. So really thank you to you all. Every place I go, people know we're doing this. They actually are offering. So thank you very much for making it possible.